Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card. Today's card is a pretty simple watercolor card using the Garden and Bloom set from Stampin' Up. I'm using this flower and also this stem. I'm also using the Alt New Label Love set for my sentiment and my Gansai Tambi watercolors. If you open it up and take a look, I've got my palettes on the lid. I'm using this dark blue and this light blue, and I also made one with this light purple and this dark purple, and there's a photo on my blog post about that. And I'm also using black, and I'll just do a little splatter with the black. Okay, so I'm going to start off by stamping my flower in VersaFine Black Onyx ink onto some Ranger watercolor paper. I'm using Ranger paper because it is very white, and I really like that about the paper. Although it's not my favorite paper, I still like the fact that it's really white. Now I'm also stamping it on a Post-it so that I can create a mask. And because the VersaFine pigment ink stays wet for longer, I can clear emboss it, and that'll help my watercolor stay in the lines. Now I'm going to cut out my Post-it and I'm going to place it onto my stamped image, and then I'll take my flower again and I'm going to stamp it a couple more times with this ink. And I'm going to make this pretty simple so that I don't have to cut out another mask. I'm just going to stamp it in the upper left hand corner, and then I'll stamp it in the lower left. That way I'm not going to overlap them. That way it's pretty easy. And then I'll go ahead and clear emboss these next two flowers quickly. And rather than moving forward with my watercolor, I decided to stamp the stems first. And what I did was I took it and I put it on my block, and then I curved it a little bit. And that way it kind of looks like the flowers are natural and not just straight up. So I'm just kind of figuring out where I'm going to stamp it, and I'll take my mask and cover that bottom flower. And then I'm going to use the same ink, and I'm going to just stamp it so that it's coming down toward the left and off the cardstock. And then to make it easy, I'm just going to flip it. That way it looks like I have a brand new stem, but it's actually just the opposite side. And I'll ink that up and make it look like it's coming from the other flower. And then for the top one, I just sort of eyeballed where it might be coming down, and then I created a third stem. And there was a little gap at the top that I felt like I needed some stems, so I went ahead and took my Copic liner and I just kind of drew in a really simple stem up there. And then you didn't have to, but you could also clear emboss the stem so that everything's even. Alright, I'm going to start with my watercolor. I've got this brush. It's kind of fat in the middle, and it has a very, very fine tip. I've got a tissue just in case I need to wipe off some water, and I've got a glass of water and my paints. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover my petal. I'm going to do one petal at a time, cover the whole thing with water, and then I'll drop in my light color, and I'm not too worried about which area. I'm just going to do an even coverage across the whole thing. I told you this is going to be really easy. So I'm going to clean off my brush, and then I'll grab a little bit of the dark color. And because this brush has a very fine tip, I'm just going to barely touch the bottom of the petal. And I'm going to tap just a few drops of color, and that's all I'm going to do. And then I'm just going to let the water do the work and let it blend out. Now these watercolors, the Gansai Tambi watercolors, they don't blend as much as some of the other watercolors on their own. Sometimes you kind of have to force a little bit of blending, and I'll show you that in a bit. But I like to kind of see what it can do on its own. But it's really nice actually that the colors don't just automatically all run together. So I'm going to continue this process all the way around the flower, and I didn't feel the need to skip petals because the petals really weren't touching each other, but I am being really careful not to touch the next petal that the petal that I just worked on, because I don't want the colors to run together. Now if you use less water, you'll get less of the blending automatically, and you'll have to kind of do it yourself a little bit. If you use more water, then you'll get much more blending. So you can see I kind of varied the water. Right here it wasn't really blending that much, so all you have to do is I just have water on my brush. I just barely even touched it right at the edge, and it reactivated it and started to blend a little bit more. But the idea is to have a watercolor look, so you don't want it to be a really nice, pretty, even blend. I'm going to go ahead and do all of these petals the same. I like to have all my flowers in a group be the same flower because I don't want to mess with what blues match or don't match or whatever, or introduce another color. I just want it to be nice and clean. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the music up, and I'll finish my coloring. Now there was just this one petal that didn't really blend out very much, this one right here. And so I'm going to take my brush that just has water on it, and I'm just going to tap it, just a very easy, light-handed tap just on the edge there, and you can see how it just brings out that color so easily and so quickly. And I'm not going to bring it out too much because I don't want too much of that dark blue. I'm going to use the same technique for my centers. I'm just going to take my brush and just wet it with the water, and then pull some of this color, it's kind of a mustardy yellow, and just drop it in there. I'm not going to worry too much about getting another shade of yellow because this area is so small. So I'm just going to drop it into the different areas. And then I'm going to let this dry completely. So I'm going to put that off to the side and work on some other things. So I've got my VersaFine. I'm going to take my Sentiment. And I love this ink so much. I always get a really good, nice, clean, completely covered image with this ink. So I just stamped it on some scratch paper, and I'm going to cut it out with a scissor. The next part is a little nerve-wracking. It's going to be creating my black splatter. So I've spent quite a bit of time on my flowers. I don't want them to get messed up. But for my splatters, I like to use a flatter brush, like a wider, flatter brush. And I don't want to put too much water, and that's the key, because if you have a lot of water, you're going to get a lot of drops, and some of them could be pretty big, and I didn't want that. So I tried it out with just a tiny bit of water, and nothing came out. So I needed a little bit more, so I dropped my brush into the water, grabbed a little bit more, mixed it in here, and then I got the perfect amount. So I'm just going to tap it a couple of times, and then I'm going to think here, I'm like, should I do one more time? I want a little bit more at the top, so I decided to do just one or two more drops, and then that was it. Alright, so now I'm going to take my Stampin' Up! Designer Series paper. I have this paper pack with all the neutrals. It's got gold, silver, and then all the neutrals, the black, grays, browns, and I've got this stripe pattern. So I'm going to take a small strip, like about 1/4 of an inch wide, and I'm going to use my 2-way glue pen, and I'm just going to glue it to the panel. This panel is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So that rather than trying to make space for it on the right of the card base, I just put it directly on my watercolor panel. And then my Sentiment, I just took some foam dimensionals, foam adhesive from Stampin' Up, and I just cut them in half so that they'd be small enough to fit on the Sentiment, and I popped it up at the bottom. And then I'll take my ATG, and I'm going to make sure I cover all my edges, because the paper is a little bit warped because it's watercolor, and I'll put it on a card base, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And then I noticed that I had some extra card base at the bottom. I don't know what caused that to happen. Maybe I just slipped on the trimmer. I don't know. But sometimes these things happen. So I have this big honkin' scissor from Stampin' Up, and I love it. It kind of reminds me of my sewing machine scissors. So I always use this to cut a card base, and it cuts the whole thing at once. And now I'm going to add some sequins. Stampin' Up! Has some sequins that are gold, white, silver, black, and clear in stars and hearts and circles. So I'm just going to grab a bunch of these out, and then I'm going to place them where I want them on my card. So I decided to use a few black, and then a clear and a white. I'm going to use my multi-matte medium. Did I get that right? I'm not sure. It's and my pick-me-up stick. So on one side of this stick, you take it off, and it's got a stickiness to it. And then on the other side, you pull out this acrylic tool that has a pointy edge right here and a chiseled edge. And I'll show you how to use this. I've used it a bunch of times before. So what I like to do is place them where I want them, and then I'll pick it up with my left hand. I'm a righty, with my pick-me-up, and then I'll squirt a little dab of the glue, and then I'll grab my little tool here and I'll place it down, and you need the tool to pull it off of the sticky stick. So it comes off quite easily with this tool. So I'm going to do this on all these sequins one at a time, and you really don't need much glue, and it's really strong. So here's my last one in place. And that's the card for today. It's a super easy watercolor technique. There's really not that much technique to it, and it was really fun to make. I also made another one with those two purple ones I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure which one I like better. I like them both. I use that same middle yellow color on this one. Anyway, so those are the cards for today, and I hope you enjoyed them, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.